his main concern is that he shows that he's met, after all this fighting, some serious political objectives. It wasn't never just about territory. It was always about subjugating Ukraine, about its ability to arm itself and to act independently of Russia. And if after the end of all of this, Ukraine can still do that, in Russia, this will be seen not almost as a defeat for Putin, that he hasn't got what he wanted. When the reckoning comes, what was all this about? Why have you spent all this resource, all these people, and you've got a bit of ruined territory at the end of it? So I think that's a problem for Putin.
Now, the talks between Russia and Ukraine in Istanbul have ended with the two sides in very different moods. The head of the Russian delegation said they were satisfied with the result and that there would be exchange of 1,000 prisoners. Meanwhile, European leaders in Albania have declared the Russian position as unacceptable, have discussed the matter with President Trump. President Zelensky outlined the need to keep the US on side.
The United States, President Trump wants to end this war. We need to keep working closely with President and stay as coordinated as possible. Long-term US support is also essential. An American backstop is needed. It's important that we all work together on every level to make that happen.
Sir Keir Starmer said earlier today that threats against Russia cannot be empty.
Now, having issued that ultimatum, we must be prepared to follow through. Because if Russia won't come to the negotiating table, Putin must pay the price. And I think yesterday, as already been mentioned, was further evidence that Putin is not serious about peace. Russia is dragging its feet and playing games, whilst Ukraine has shown itself to be the party of peace.
Well, let's speak now to Volodymyr Handoi, who is Ukraine's former ambassador to London and NATO. Good afternoon to you, Volodymyr.
Yeah, good afternoon.
So you can't be surprised by this outcome, unfortunately.
No, of course, I'm not surprised, as nobody was surprised. Nobody expected, actually, any breakthrough. But it is important that the delegations met. And the most important thing in this situation is that Ukraine demonstrated its readiness. You know, this readiness of Ukraine to follow the diplomatic path was questioned, and now it's obvious that we are for negotiations, but we are for meaningful negotiations. And the other side, in Russia, they don't want to, and they're dragging foot, actually.
So you do think that there was something achieved out of today's negotiations, other than just, really dancing to Putin's tune and allowing him to play for yet more time?
No, number one, we opened up a channel of communication that was closed for almost 3 years now. The other important thing, I think, maybe not so important as compared to the strategic goal, is that this exchange of prisoners, 1,000 for 1,000. Actually, the Ukrainian proposal was everybody for everybody, but it wasn't possible, I think. And this, so to say, a step forward as opposed to the position that Russia was taking previously. So this is a humanitarian aspect. Exchange of prisoners is an important outcome. And number three, I think, is that they have agreed to continue.
Okay. I just wonder whether if you look at how Ukraine has handled itself in these peace talks and the fact that Putin didn't turn up, what Donald Trump has said about that, do you think the US is warming to the idea of sort of punitive sanctions against Putin in a way that Europe is ready to put more sanctions on the table? Are you hopeful of that?
I'm very hopeful. I think the American side should actually judge actions by Putin and respond adequately. And the adequate response to what Russia is pursuing these days is pressure. The diplomatic path is very important, but diplomacy without a pressure would not bring us to a result.
Right, so bring the sanctions on. Do you think there is any sort of prospect in the near term? Is there any advantage in the near term of Putin and Zelensky actually meeting?
Of course, there is a prospect. I don't know how close it is, but without a clear message from Russian side that they would be serious and they would like to negotiate the substance of the matter, This meeting is not possible, I think. So once again, Ukraine demonstrated its readiness. We want to discuss ceasefire as a minimum that can be achieved and at this stage. If Russia agreed to this, President Zelensky is ready to meet with Putin. But I feel, something is telling me that Russia is not ready for that, and they don't want really meaningful negotiations. Rather, they would like to go on using this opportunity as the sort of dragging feet diplomacy.
There have been some signs in the last few days that Trump is maybe losing patience with Putin a bit. But let me just put to you what one of our listeners has just messaged in, saying this: Trump has just been manoeuvring the situation for cover to meet Putin for his own purposes, and he will ensure Ukraine is the loser of any discussion. UK and Europe must protest and stand behind Zelensky. I mean, leaving aside that final sentiment, that message, do you think it is the case that Trump is still on the Putin side, and that you are going to end up being the losers because of that?
Well, I hate to say that, actually. Sometimes he sounds like he's on the Putin side, but on other occasions he's telling something else. So it's very difficult to really understand what his real position is. But lately there were clear signs which we saw, actually, that he supported the position of Ukraine. Even lately, he appreciated the readiness of Zelensky to meet with Putin. And I think his patience is also running out as far as Putin is, concerning Putin is.
Right.
So I think that we need to have Trump on board. This is the main thing.
Volodymyr Handoi, thank you very much for joining us, Ukraine's former ambassador to London and NATO there. Well, let's speak now to Sir Lawrence Freedman, who's Professor Emeritus of War Studies at King's College London, joins me on the line now. Good afternoon, Sir Lawrence.
Good afternoon.
You heard the ambassador there talking about how actually he felt these talks hadn't gone that badly for Ukraine. Do you think that anything was achieved by this meeting, or was it just a waste of everybody's time and sort of, people dancing to Putin's tune, allowing him to play for time again?
I don't think it's as simple as that. I think first you've got prisoners of war released, so that's good news for them and their families. Secondly, they seem to have agreed to talk more. Third, I suspect for both sides, they'd rather the talks continued at this level, at a sort of quite practical, technical level, rather than having a Putin-Trump summit to sort it out, because for both Ukraine and to some extent for Russia, there are risks in that. I think the Russians are desperate, as has been indicated, not to see a definitive end to this process. Which would require Trump eventually to make his mind up about stronger sanctions.
Well, that's fine. I'll come back to the sanctions in just a moment, but it's fascinating that you say that there are risks to both sides of Putin and Zelensky sitting down. But I wonder, you look at the last 3 years, more than 3 years of carnage, the unbelievable human toll, and yet that would seem to point to the fact that it is in Ukraine's interests to strike a peace deal, however compromised. But on the other hand, could you also make the argument that it's in the interest of the wider world and Europe for Ukraine to keep fighting, and thereby depriving Russia of a chance to rearm and potentially strike elsewhere?
Oh, I think Ukraine and Europe would be quite happy if there was a ceasefire, as long as it didn't involve any major concessions of substance. I mean, if you have a ceasefire, obviously de facto you've left Russia in control of a chunk of Ukrainian territory, and that territory will then be harder to get back. But as long as Ukraine has its independence, its sovereignty, is able to maintain its own forces, get support from partners for its future security and so on, Ukraine, I think, would be content. So I don't think Ukraine is against the idea of a ceasefire, nor is anybody, I hope, going to encourage it to fight come what may just because it hurts the Russians.
Well, even if it has to give up a load of territory, which is what is currently sort of are being proposed.
Well, it hasn't got an easy way of getting that territory back at the moment. It won't give it up forever. I mean, it's not going to say we we allow you to annex not only Crimea, but Donetsk and Luhansk and Zaporizhzhia and Kherson and so on. It's not going to say that. But as a matter of fact, the Russians control this at the moment, and they have got to work out what they do with it. And, they've sort of doubled the amount of territory they've had. Since 2022, it's not it's a chunk, but it's there's an awful lot of Ukraine still left.
But if they go for a ceasefire, does it not allow Russia to rearm, and that potentially imperils other countries in NATO, for example?
Well, sure. I mean, it allows both countries to rearm, and that's why the conditions of a ceasefire matter. I think there's a big problem for Putin. And that's clearly evidenced in the positions that they've taken with a ceasefire without a political settlement, because his main concern is that he shows that he's met, after all this fighting, some serious political objectives. It wasn't never just about territory. It was always about subjugating Ukraine, about its ability to arm itself and to act independently of Russia. And if after the end of all of this, Ukraine can still do that, in Russia, this will be seen almost as a defeat for Putin, that he hasn't got what he wanted. When the reckoning comes, what was all this about? Why have you spent all this resource, all these people, and you've got a bit of ruined territory at the end of it? So I think that's a problem for Putin.
So how do we put maximum power, maximum pressure on Putin at the moment? I mean, how likely is it, do you think, that the EU has sanctions ready to go, but do you think the US is starting to warm to sanctions? There are some indications, aren't there? Punitive sanctions, I mean.
There's already been 16 layers.
Yeah, I mean, you know what I mean.
We're talking about extra stuff, and a lot of it will be focused on oil. Mm-hmm. And of course, the oil price has dropped since the Trump tariffs. It covered a bit, but it could well drop. Actually, been dropping a bit more because of the potential of a deal with Iran. So the economic pressure is there, and it can be intensified. It's difficult. I think what you're trying to do is to create conditions in which Putin has to face the futility of what he's doing. So it's not only economic sanctions, you do need material support for Ukraine as well. And the Europeans understand, I think, that they've got to do a lot more than they did in the past, and the Americans will do less, but they still need some support from the Americans.
Do you think they'll get that? Because Trump's kept his cards very close to his chest on that.
Well, there's been a couple of positive signs. They're not going to get a major supplemental bill like they got last year from the Biden administration, which took a lot of getting. I think just the American budget is going to be in sufficient of a mess for there not to be the spare capacity for that. But even if, as long as they keep on getting the intelligence support, that the material that's already been authorized continues to go through, and that the Europeans, if necessary, are able to buy stuff from the United States to pass on in terms of the high-end air defense stuff, HIMARS and things like that. If they can do that, then Ukraine can keep going. A lot of Ukraine material, the defense equipment, they produce themselves now. The drones they produce themselves.
Yeah.
So they can keep going, and that's important. So I think Putin's has a problem, which is not the same as saying, he's at a cliff edge on his policy.
Yeah. So Lawrence Freedman, thank you very much for joining us. Professor Emeritus of War Studies at King's College London there.